This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 668 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Before we get into the mailbag questions this week, I want to remind you about the Establish the Run draft kit. Establish the Run has rankings for any fantasy format you might be playing in, and they continuously update as news breaks. You also get access to Evan Silva's top 150, and along with it, a change log that you can read to see why players are moving up and down his draft board. It's a great way to make sure you understand why players are ranked where they are, because the goal is to help you make better decisions, not tell you who to pick. And if you're into best ball drafting, their strategy rankings and insight can help you out a ton with roster construction. Established Run gives you a different perspective on fantasy football than I do, and I think the combination of my work and theirs can help make this draft season a successful one. So head over to establishedrun.com and purchase their draft kit. When you do, use promo code JJ for a 10% discount. That's promo code JJ. I also wanted to remind you to check out FanDuel Face-Off. FanDuel Face-Off is where you compete in quick, fun games against other real people for real cash. It has all sorts of games that you're familiar with, like a home run derby, Wheel of Fortune, puzzle and strategy games, with more on the way. Contests are action-packed and last between 2 to 5 minutes, so you can play on your couch, waiting in line, during a commercial break, wherever, and all on your schedule. Plus, you can practice for free anytime. Whether it be head-to-head, multiplayer, or larger tournaments, FanDuel Face-Off has something for you. Plus, in most contests, you'll be matched against other players with similar skill levels, so you're never totally overmatched. Face-Off is also tied to your FanDuel account and wallet, so you can easily use your daily fantasy funds or sportsbook winnings in the app. Visit FanDuel.com/faceoff or download the FanDuel Face-Off app in the Apple App Store today to get in the game. Age and location restrictions apply, void where prohibited. See FanDuel.com/faceoff-terms for terms and conditions. The first question this week is from Twitter. It's from @manwithtakes. It says, why do you think the fantasy community largely turned a blind eye to Lance's major red flag, which is Jimmy G being on the roster? Kyle Shanahan doesn't seem to be in love with him, and most reports throughout the summer have not been positive. Do you have a process for eliminating biases? So this was easily the top question this week, and it wasn't close, so let's dig in. Jimmy Garoppolo is sticking around as a 49er for now. But I want to answer this question of, why do you think the fantasy community largely turned a blind eye to Lance's major red flag of Jimmy Garoppolo being on the roster? I mean, for one, I don't think Jimmy G staying in San Francisco was the likely outcome here. They were openly trying to trade him. They openly talked about it. He even practiced differently than the rest of the team. To say that the fantasy community turned a blind eye to this major red flag is not fair at all. I think the majority of people saw this, the 49ers included, as a situation where Garoppolo would be dealt. And I don't really understand this narrative of Kyle Shanahan not being in love with Trey Lance. We have no idea if that's the case or not. And I also wouldn't say that most reports throughout the summer haven't been positive. I mean, what would a positive report do here? No offense to the reporting coming out in San Francisco, but remember last year? Remember when Elijah Mitchell out of nowhere played ahead of Trey Sermon? There weren't reports of that really happening throughout the offseason. And I really don't say that as a dig. I just say it as a reminder that reports are not everything. The 49ers have a lot invested in Trey Lance. They've handed this team off to him. Kyle Shanahan has openly said that at press conferences. I know we don't want to believe coaches, but when it's that overt, you kind of have to believe him. So Lance is going to get his shot. And when he starts, he's going to be fantasy relevant because of his rushing. But the ceiling could be completely unlocked if things come together through the air for him. And I think of almost any situation in football, I'd be most bullish about a quarterback on the 49ers because of the system and because of their weapons. Garoppolo himself was second in the NFL in yards per attempt last year, and he just signed a deal to be a backup. What does that tell you? Maybe the injury is the reason he couldn't get dealt, but if he was good enough, he would have been dealt. This system is that good. And maybe I'm just being naive here. That's totally possible. Maybe the 49ers wanted to do this all along. I just don't see that being the case given what they've been saying, how they've been treating him, and the investment that they made in Trey Lance. It's insurance for Lance, yes. But I don't buy this idea that the instant Lance does something wrong, Jimmy Garoppolo is going in. Because they've got a lot riding on Trey Lance. My hope here is that Lance's ADP does indeed fall this weekend. That when you're drafting this weekend, you can get Trey Lance for even cheaper. Because he's the right kind of bet to make at quarterback in fantasy football. This next question is from Patreon. It's from Nick. It says, hey, JJ, not trying to play down a terrible situation here with Brian Robinson, but how would you be approaching the Washington backfield now that he's out for a good while and Patterson got cut? Now, I don't want to sound like being a fantasy football analyst is the hardest job in the world, because it's not. There are far more important jobs out there. Trust me, I'm aware of how unimportant I am to the world. All I do is make you more unproductive at work. But the hardest part of my job is having to talk about fantasy football after these tough off-the-field situations happen. Fortunately, Brian Robinson's going to be okay, but I hope people know that I don't think fantasy football is more important than his health. With that being said, this is my job, so I've got to analyze the impact of Brian Robinson being out. I don't think the Jarrett Patterson release necessarily tells us anything about Antonio Gibson. I think it might signal that Robinson's outlook is more favorable than initially thought. With Gibson, I'm just afraid. I did take him in a draft the other night at the 8-9 turn, which was the first time that I've drafted him in managed leagues this month. But when a team is doing things against a player, signing J.D. McKissic, drafting Brian Robinson, talking about a split backfield, it doesn't make me feel confident in that player, even when his workload situation improves. And in situations like this, a player's cost doesn't remain the same. Gibson's price tag is rising. We also know with Gibson that he has a cap ceiling with J.D. McKissic still there. Gibson had just 2 games last year with McKissic active where he saw a double-digit percentage target share. That's an 18% rate. Without McKissic, that rate jumped to 60%, 3 of 5 games. Without McKissic down the stretch last season, Gibson had 3 top 10 performances in 5 games. He had 1 top 10 performance in PPR formats when McKissic was healthy. I mean, let's not pretend that Brian Robinson was the only running back holding Antonio Gibson back. It's just that Robinson made him riskier. Because Robinson himself has a 3-down skill set and isn't a bad player. That's what I alluded to on Monday's episode. I should say, though, that part of the reason that Gibson is a little bit more attractive is his early season schedule. If you go with like a hero RB approach, Gibson's a little bit easier to draft. Because the Commanders get the Jags and the Lions to start the year. So Gibson will have an opportunity to not be game scripted out. He could actually be pretty productive for you. So if you need that immediate production given your build, I don't think Gibson is that bad of a choice. But from a season-long perspective, yes, I'm still worried. We still have to be concerned about J.D. McKissic's presence in this offense. And then let's cross our fingers that Robinson is back sooner rather than later. This next question is from Twitter. It's from my friend at Dave Kluge. It says, with the depth of veteran quarterbacks on explosive offenses, Rodgers, Stafford, Cousins, Carr, and high upside young quarterbacks, Lance, Fields, Lawrence, Wilson, is this a year where it might make sense to wait on and stream quarterbacks? So I wrote about this in detail in the late round draft guide, which is still available over on lateround.com. And I've really talked about this on the show over the last couple of years. But the reason people are drafting quarterbacks a little bit earlier than they did like 5 years ago isn't necessarily because these high-end quarterbacks are giving you some huge edge in points per game differential. It's more so that they're becoming more predictable. That we know who the top quarterbacks are going to be. Just to give you an example of what I mean, in the draft guide, I looked at top 18 quarterbacks by ADP by year. And then I compared and found the correlation between top 18 quarterbacks by ADP and points per game, or how many points per game they scored. So we've got how we viewed quarterbacks entering the season versus how they actually performed. I looked at this since 2011, and there were some seasons like 2015 and 2018 where the correlation was literally 0. Where QBs 10 through 18 scored just as well as QBs 1 through 9. But the last 2 years, we've seen by far the highest correlations between ADP and points per game. And it's because of rushing. It's because there are more dual threat quarterbacks who can also get it done through the air, and the market is finally recognizing that. Rushing numbers are stickier year over year than passing numbers are. If I were to ask you who's going to throw more touchdowns this year, Kyler Murray or Tom Brady, most of you would say Tom Brady. But would you be that surprised if Brady has worse passing numbers than Kyler Murray? Now, same question, but for rushing. Would you be surprised if Brady had better rushing numbers than Kyler Murray? That question and the answer to that question seems a lot more lopsided. What that means is that streaming is more difficult than it used to be, because finding replacement level players at quarterback is now a little bit tougher. This is why over the last 2 seasons, my streaming Frankenstein that I put together with my co-host Denny Carter on Living the Stream, it's been way worse than other seasons. If you want an easier bet to make, just bet on quarterbacks who get drafted in the QB9 to QB12 range. Because realistically, I do think the predictability at quarterback over the last 2 years has almost been too good. It's been too predictable. When we get more dual threat guys into the quarterback pool, or when we get more elite pocket passers, that correlation is bound to drop. But the QB9 to the QB12 range has been really, really good over the last couple of years. And it has some good quarterbacks in it this year. And you're not having to weigh the possibility of this being the year where that predictability really does drop. Because when that happens, the higher end quarterbacks that you draft, they're going to become a lot less valuable. Now, I don't think going with a late round quarterback strategy is the worst idea in the world or anything. I like Justin Fields. I don't mind Kirk Cousins and Derek Carr. I just don't think that you should feel good about streaming. It's a difficult thing to do in today's environment because of these dual threat quarterbacks. You should be expecting a QB10 to QB12 in points per game if you do go the streaming route. But hey, maybe this will be the year that things become less predictable at the position. This next question is from Patreon. It's from Jackson. With the news of Marlon Mack being cut, he's now in the practice squad. How much does that change your outlook on Dameon Pierce? I'm wondering if his ADP will start to get too costly. Feels like not enough is being made of the fact that the Texans' offensive situation isn't very good and that Burkhead will likely have some role within this offense. Yeah, that's the fear. I talked about Dameon Pierce on Monday's episode, so I don't want to just say all that stuff once again. I think he's a good prospect. I think he's an intriguing running back for 2022. And I do think he's capable of being that passing down back for the Texans. The question is, does Houston? Because at the end of the day, these are coaching decisions. And if they like Rex Burkhead in that role, then Dameon Pierce's upside is really, really capped. Because we're then talking about an early down back on a bad team. That's the exact type of player that you should be fading in fantasy football. A negative game script has the potential to just wipe them out. I was in a big money draft the other night, and Dameon Pierce went ahead of Breece Hall, and I cannot get behind that. I've had him as a value throughout the offseason. I like Dameon Pierce, but the price is climbing a ton in sharper leagues. Maybe a home league would look a little bit different, but I'd have a hard time taking him over someone like A.J. Dillon, for example. I think from here on out, we're bound to see wildly different costs with Dameon Pierce. I think you're looking at this the right way, though. It's absolutely possible that he takes on a 3-down role at some point this season. And I actually do think he's capable. It's just a question of whether or not the Texans are willing to give it to him. This next question is from Twitter. It's from @DryGuyRye. It says, can we get the usual early season streamers for defense and tight end? So I don't think tight end streaming is really a thing at the start of the season. Hopefully you walked away with a decent one in your draft. And if you didn't, you can be reactive to some early season usage. With defense though, one that I've targeted is San Francisco. They get the Bears and the Seahawks to start the season. The Broncos are another team with a good schedule to start the year, with the Seahawks and Texans in weeks 1 and 2. Washington, as I alluded to earlier with Antonio Gibson, they get Jacksonville and Detroit. The Colts get Houston and Jacksonville. And Cleveland, even though they might not be in super positive game scripts with Jacoby Brissett, they'll face Carolina, the Jets, the Steelers, and the Falcons weeks 1 through 4. And if you want to use one of those defenses with 2 easy games to start the year, the Chargers then have good weeks 3 and 4 matchups against Jacksonville and Houston. So those are some defenses to look for on your waiver wire right away. The last question this week is from @Leps_T. It says, what is your advice for handcuffs? I currently have Dalvin Cook, and with his injury history, I also drafted Alexander Mattison late. Do you think it's smart to hold a handcuff early in the season, or would you rather pick him up in the middle or later in the season? Not at all, or hold a different player's handcuff? So I've done research on breakout running backs, and I've done research specifically on handcuffing running backs. And that research points to handcuffing being a bad idea for a handful of reasons. Number one, injuries don't usually occur right away for running backs. So often you're just holding onto that handcuff for a really, really long time. And they're typically the first player to get cut from your roster because it's so freaking annoying having that asset on your bench doing absolutely nothing. Number 2, we often don't even get the handcuff right. I think Alexander Mattison is a high-end handcuff, yes. But what if this new coaching staff likes Ty Chandler more than we think? Number 3, even when we do get the handcuff right, he's not an automatic producer. I did a study on handcuffs like 4 years ago, and I basically found that when we got handcuffs right and they entered the game and played, they were still like RB3s in fantasy football. Now, let me put a little caveat on all this. Your league structure matters entirely. If you're in a deep league where a lot of players are rostered, it's fine to go after a player who's a traditional handcuff. And honestly, the thing that annoys me most about this discussion is that the definition of handcuff is wildly different across the fantasy football world. Like, to me, Tony Pollard is absolutely not a handcuff. He has standalone value. Handcuffs, to me, are players who are backing up elite running backs in fantasy football who have no value unless that elite running back gets hurt. So A.J. Dillon, not a handcuff. My stance has also been that if you're going to handcuff a running back, you should handcuff a running back on a different team, unless your current team is absolutely stacked and you need to play it safe. Like, let's say that you don't have Dalvin Cook, but you do have Alexander Mattison. If Cook gets hurt, then you have another usable running back on your roster. It's a high ceiling play rather than a high floor play. And yes, I understand that if you have Dalvin Cook and not Alexander Mattison, then you get really screwed if Dalvin Cook gets hurt. That's why I'm saying it's a high ceiling play. And in fantasy football, I think chasing ceiling is what you really should be doing. And I want to add that I don't believe handcuffing is bad all season long. I talk about handcuffs in my later season 15 transactions articles all the time. I just prefer not to draft them and to instead go after running backs who have a chance to be productive for my roster right away without an injury. At the start of the season, so much is up in the air. So I like throwing darts at players without studs in their backfield since those players have a shot to be usable without an injury. I know this is going to be shocking, but I don't think handcuffing is a black and white issue. In most cases, I am against it. But there are some cases where I'm for it. One thing I do know, though, is that we think we know a lot more than we actually do when entering a season. The players we think are handcuffs end up not being handcuffs. So definitely keep that in mind. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. The in-season content is starting next week. Make sure you check out lateround.com. Join the Patreon. If you have a draft this weekend or next week, buy the draft guide. It should help you out. Join the newsletter for free as well. I appreciate all of you guys listening. Thank you so much. Enjoy the long weekend. I'll be back on Tuesday.